So we're going to be talking about basically the main halachas this week that have to do with chametz. What is chametz? What's the background to some of the practical ideas that we actually do to clean for Pesach? Where is it coming from? What's the idea behind it? And what's the differences between the different areas in the house? And for starters, we'll just mention that there's in the world of Pesach in general, there's the main halacha, and there are a lot of stringencies that do come into Pesach. And we find the background, Paul. We definitely mentioned this in the Masechtas Pesachim class, that there was a story that Rabbi Yitzchak of Berditchev, he was one of the great Hasidic masters that lived in Europe. And Rabbi Yitzchak of Berditchev, one time he turned to his entire congregation and he said to them, he said, there's a decree right now from the Tsar that nobody should have a certain kind of tobacco that was contraband at that time, and it was under the death penalty. And he said to the people inside the synagogue, he said, please, I really want some of that. Could somebody get a hold of it for me? And everybody turned to him and they said, Rabbi, they said, hold on a minute, we'll get you some. And this one went back to the back of his shop and he pulled out some from under the table. And this went back to where he sold it illegally somewhere else. And everybody was able to get for him some of that tobacco. And then when they came back, he said to them, he said, now could somebody get me chametz? And everybody looked at him and they said, Rabbi, we don't have any chametz in our house. There's not even a crumb in our house. And Rabbi Yitzchak Berditchev, he looked up to Shemayim and he said, listen, the Tsar put a death penalty on this illegal tobacco. And look how many people have it inside their houses. And Moshe Rabbeinu taught us so many years ago that we shouldn't have chametz in our house. And look how far everybody went that they shouldn't even have a crumb of chametz. And we see this background of how we treat the idea of chametz, that there's the law of what we need to do, and then there's the beyond the law that we've been doing for many years, and we'll differentiate in every step of the way the difference between the law and what's going beyond that. So the beginning of the idea of getting rid of all the chametz, so this starts from the Gemara, that on the night of the 14th, we look through our homes to make sure that we don't have any chametz in any spot within our home. And essentially at that time, all the chametz cleaning, essentially all the checking, it doesn't mention anything before that all started on the night prior to the 14th.
Yeah.
And at that night, a night prior to the 14th, we were looking around for the chametz. And then the next day, anything that they had, they either burnt or sold to a non-Jew. This kind of became not so possible in today that it used to be. They used to have one or two rooms. They used to have basically a very basic outdoor oven. They had a very basic pots that they used to use. So therefore, everything was very simple to be able to do with one day. But today, Pesach cleaning became much longer just by the fact that we have much larger homes and just by the fact that we have much more complex and complicated kitchens. When I was in Eretz Yisrael about 2 years ago, or actually a little more than that, Rabbi was talking about cleansing the kitchen and going through the kitchen, having to do it before the time you burn the chametz. And I was trying to think to myself, who does that? You see that in Yerushalayim, there were still people that they started from the evening before, the night of the checking for chametz, and then by the next morning, they had something called the sponge gedola. I was walking in Givat Shol once, and there was floods of water. This was on the day before Pesach, floods of water coming out of the houses. And I was trying to figure out why this stream is coming down all the steps. And I asked somebody, I said, what do you mean? This is the sponge gedola, the day before everybody floods their houses, and all chametz that's there starts getting washed out into the street. But to the most degree, today we don't really do everything the day before. And we start from a number of days in advance looking and for any chametz that might be around the houses. And the question is, what are we looking for? What are we trying to get rid of? And essentially, there are two reasons why we look for chametz and why we get rid of chametz on the night before. One reason that's given is because of the prohibition of bal yira'eh or bal yimatzeh, that we shouldn't find any chametz within our house. We shouldn't see it. We shouldn't own it. And this prohibition essentially only applies to something that's more than the size of an olive, which is 30 grams. Anything that's less than that amount, there's no prohibition, and we could have Cheerios technically all over the place. We could have super snacks. We could have even pieces of spaghetti, as long as it's smaller than 30 grams, and we have it in the bedroom. So there's absolutely no problem of bal yira'eh or bal yimatzeh, that we shouldn't own it. But there's another reason that the Talmud gives, which is that we get rid of it in order that we shouldn't come to eat it. And the factor that we shouldn't come to eat it is essentially going to take things a little bit past just looking for objects within the bedrooms that are more than 30 grams. Because the Mishnah Berurah brings opinions that say that the need to get rid of chametz, the need to get rid of pieces of bread, even less than 30 grams, that we shouldn't need to eat it, exists because if we have a Cheerio, you find in the middle of Pesach, somebody finds a Cheerio on the countertop, they might just pop it in their mouth. And therefore, it says in Mishnah Berurah that we should get rid of even smaller objects, even smaller pieces, less than 30 grams. However, if it's something that's already dirty and we're not going to come to eat it, then there's no necessity, essentially, to get rid of it. So if we start the house right now with the bedrooms, so practically when it comes to cleaning through the bedrooms, so essentially the main thing that we're looking for is any big piece of chametz, looking in the closets or in any place that we generally bring in chametz. Any place we don't bring in chametz, unless there's little children around that bring it to every little place. So any place that we essentially do bring in chametz sometimes, for instance, if sometimes we do bring up, breakfast and bread, we bring food up to the bedroom, or if we have certain drawers that we store it in. So in those areas, essentially what we're looking for is pieces that are more than 30 grams. However, because there are opinions that say that even if it's less than 30 grams, we should get rid of it, because we might end up eating it, not necessarily because we're planning on eating chametz on Pesach, just by the fact it's around, and sometimes we pop things into our mouth. So therefore, we should look through the drawers and even get rid of things that are less than 30 grams. However, what about the things that are stuck inside the cracks inside the drawers, or if there's like the air conditioner vent on the floor and there's dust and there's dirt in there, and therefore anything that's small is not going to be something we're going to pop into our mouth. So essentially, those little crumbs that are hanging around don't have a form now of edible chametz. It's not something we're going to pop into our mouth. And therefore, those little crumbs that aren't enjoyable to eat, we don't essentially have to get rid of them. So therefore, the dirty cracks inside the drawers that are in the bedrooms, the vents, and those little things that have only small particles of chametz, if they're larger than 30 grams, if it's a bigger piece, so then it's already going to be not enough if it's just dirty. But if it's a small little particles that are dirty, we don't have to worry about eating them on Pesach, and therefore we don't have to scrub out the cracks and the crevices or anything else, because we're not going to come to eat them. That's about essentially the main concepts involving the bedroom. When we get to the bathrooms, it gets a little more complicated. This is kind of, I guess, in the Pesach cleaning, when we're first starting off in the bedrooms. The next place we kind of are going to is generally the bathrooms. Now, why are we checking the bathrooms at all? So if somebody has little kids around, then it's definitely known, because I know in our house, we definitely find different particles of food in the bathrooms, as somebody's in the middle of eating a bag of chips and they have to use a little child and they have to use the bathroom, so they take the chips with them. But for somebody who doesn't bring any of that kind of food into the bathroom, so what are you even checking in your bathroom? A number of years ago, I actually met there was a Muslim guy that was around the neighborhood. He was around my age, and he was around the neighborhood we lived in. And one day he asked me if I wanted to play basketball, and I told him, I said, we're not going to play. I said, today we're fasting. He said, come on, you guys really fast? I said, yeah, it's a fast today. He said, everybody knows that even the imam stores food in their bathroom on Ramadan. So essentially, we don't have that problem that we store food in the bathroom, so we don't have to worry about that. But there's many other products in the bathroom, and that's what we have to figure out. We have shampoos, we have toothpaste, we have perfumes, and all of them are based on not all of them, but many of them are based on a chametz background, on alcohol that's derived from grains. And the question is that a problem or is it not a problem? So before discussing this, there are two other points that are very important to know before getting to this actual question. We talked about that the main cleansing process, the main chametz, that is this so far clear, everybody? Everyone could type in if there's anything we should go over or anything we should clarify.
Don't do that.
Okay, anybody can interject with this. Definitely on the there's a sidebar on the side. Anybody can type in anything, or if we should re-clarify anything else. Essentially, there are two main stipulations that kind of, in many, many instances and many, many cases, they're going to make the necessity to have to get rid of something because of ownership, or because of ownership, or because of needing to come to eat to it, entirely irrelevant. And one of those cases is something that's not edible. And what does it mean not edible? What means not edible is that it's not even edible to a dog. Because if it's not even edible to a dog, then it's not food anymore. This is a rock, this is dirt, this is another reality, another being, but it doesn't retain its idea of being chametz anymore because it's not edible even to a dog. And a dog is an example because it's a house creature, so it's used to food that's inside the house as opposed to something that's in the wild that might eat anything. Another stipulation is that even if it can't be eaten by a human being, and also it's mixed with other ingredients, so says the Shulchan Aruch, which is Rav Yosef Kairo's Charter of Law, says the Shulchan Aruch, it's also not a problem to own this. However, now that we just mentioned that we can't own a piece of chametz, or we can't eat it. If we can't own it if it's more than 30 grams, we're afraid we might eat it even if it's less than that, even if it's a small particle, unless it's dirty or something else. And then we mentioned stipulations that if it is something that even can't be eaten by a dog or it can't be eaten by a human being and it's together with a mixture, there's no problem whatsoever. However, what happens if there's something that you have a piece of chametz that can't even be eaten by a dog? Even a dog, you give it to your dog and you put it outside and it's not going to go near it, it's not going to touch it. However, you take this piece of chametz and put it in, someone puts it in their mouth and eats it. Are they going to go against the prohibition of not eating chametz or not? So states the Gemara, states the Talmud, and this is said in Shulchan Aruch, that there's something called achshave, that you now created, that even though technically this should not be a food substance, but since the person themselves ate it, they're showing that it is food to them, and therefore they are now go against the prohibition of eating chametz because they created that by their action that they did of putting it in their mouth. They created that to now be a piece of chametz. And everyone's probably looking right now and saying, why is this relevant? Because there's no reason in the world that we're going to eat something that's not edible. But actually, this is extremely relevant in the following, what we're talking about in the realm of toothpaste, actually when we get into medicine and toothpaste. But before we get to that, let's start with the first idea of not being edible even to a dog. So now, if a person has shampoo, soap, and these products that are essentially come from part of the derivatives in them, and hand soap is alcohol, do we have to get rid of them or not? So essentially, Rav Asher Weiss, I've heard even from Talmidei Rav Moshe Feinstein saying from him, and it's the general consensus, is that these things aren't edible. So since they're not edible, we don't have to get rid of them, and we can even use them because they don't become a food substance. There are those that are stringent on these areas, and part of it, as we discussed, the idea of Pesach, some people are more stringent. However, somebody once came to Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he said to Rabbi Shlomo Zalman, he said, what, soap and shampoo wouldn't be eaten by a dog? So Rabbi Shlomo Zalman told him, he said, well, go take it to your dog. In Toronto, it's not so hard to test this out. Give it to your dog and see if he's going to eat it or not. And somebody else came to Rabbi Shlomo Zalman, and he said to Rabbi Shlomo Zalman, he said, I heard of a story where a dog actually ate shampoo. So Rabbi Shlomo Zalman looked at him, he said, a crazy hund, meaning it's a dog that's not stable. So essentially, the opinion of most the halachic authorities are that since it's not edible in any form, so therefore it's not chametz. According to the criteria we said that any chametz that won't be eaten by a dog, and not just that criteria, also the other criteria that's not edible by a human being and it's mixed with other particles, it's mixed with other ingredients. So therefore it doesn't pose a problem to be able to have it and use it on Pesach. There is an exception to what's very relevant today, which is rubbing alcohol. Because rubbing alcohol is alcohol in its pure form. And Rav Moshe Feinstein in Yoredei Gimel, he writes, in Orach Chaim Gimel, he writes that this alcohol, being that it can be drinking within a mix, if you put it inside, inside orange juice or something else, you could use it as alcohol. So therefore, since you can use it as alcohol, and it's able to be drinking in that form, so therefore Moshe Feinstein says not to have this alcohol and to sell it to a non-Jew before Pesach. But he continues in his tshuva that any alcohol that's mixed into other things, for instance, shampoo and soap or anything else, Moshe continues that is entirely fine because that is entirely not edible. There are those that wanted to raise a different point by by perfumes. Because they quote a study. This study was actually it was in The Economist, November 29th, page 13. They record over there that in Russia, there's a big part of the population that consumes perfumes and other of these kind of things in order to become intoxicated. And actually, they quote that there were articles that prisoners in the same respect also used to eat these kind of perfumes or different things because alcohol wasn't allowed in order to become intoxicated. So they wanted to say that, hey, you see that perfume is essentially edible. What does everybody think about that? Would that be considered edible, or is that still not considered non-edible? So Paul, the only one I can see, and I see you're shaking your hand, you can definitely write in what would be the difference? Why, if so many people are eating it, why is it still not essentially considered edible? You can always type in a response also.
Because it's poisonous.
So the question is, does poisonous essentially make that something is not edible? Probably it would be, but these people kind of survived. Is that a question of the fact they survived? Or is that so Effie's saying we don't live in Russia. I hear, meaning that in our population, somebody does that, it would be batle daite. We would not consider his opinion, just like we just mentioned that Rabbi Shlomo Zalman didn't even want to consider the opinion of that dog because he said he's crazy. So that's definitely true that it could be that that's not the stable. And even to go a step farther, we could say another point, and this is the point that many halachic authorities answered them. Many halachic authorities, they answered them, and they said, yes, it's true that they ate them, But the goal wasn't to eat the food. The goal was to become intoxicated. So they ate something that wasn't edible in order to have that end goal. And technically, if you would have gone over to them and said, if you eat a pail of dirt, you'll also become intoxicated. Yes, in prison and in Russia, they eat it also, and they probably prefer that because it's cheaper. So it's not essentially that the reason why they were eating it is not to consider it a food. It doesn't essentially show that it's an edible item. It's just that they were willing to eat something not edible in order to have the end result of the intoxication. So therefore, the opinion of most authorities, at least all the ones that I've actually spoken to, have said that perfume is in the same realm of shampoos and soaps. That there is a place to be stringent. There are opinions that say that since they actually say a different idea since it can be distilled, but the main idea of the main opinions of the authorities are they don't have to be gotten rid of the shampoos, the soaps, nor the perfumes. And that's what Rav Asher Weiss told us, and that's many other places, or all the places that I've spoken to have said that we don't have to get rid of these items. Now, there are two items that are essentially a bit more complicated. One of them is toothpaste, and another one is medicines for somebody who, obviously we're not talking about as somebody who it's dangerous, meaning it's a chayil sheyesh bei sakana. It's a chayil that if he doesn't take the medicine, something serious could happen to him. But for a regular person that he wants to take a medicine that to make him feel a little bit better, that has a chametz inside it, can he take it? So on one hand, you could say, hey, the medicine is essentially not edible. But on the other hand, the fact that he's eating the medicine, maybe we say that that's called achshave. He's considering it a food. So what do you say, Effie, on this one? So essentially,
isn't that the same as the perfume? He's not eating it because it's food. He's eating it because he wants to get better. There's an end result.
Yeah, that's an amazing idea. And the Chazon Ish essentially says the same idea. The Chazon Ish says that if there's a compound within the medicine that he's not eating it as a food, he's eating it just to get better. It's not a food item. It's not something that he's trying to eat because he wants to eat it as a food. And therefore, says the Chazon Ish, that, and Shlomo Zalman quotes him in Halicha Shlomo, that medicine is not a problem if there's a chametz ingredient that's there just to hold it together or something else, because the point of the medicine is also just to get better in the same way that they're consuming the alcohol or the alcoholic product just because they want the end result, but not that in itself. However, Shlomo Zalman differentiates, and he said that if it's one of these, they usually don't make it for adults, but for children they do. But if it's a tasty tablet and it is something that's edible, and if it's something, when they have those jelly beers, they used to have them, which are vitamins for children, they would line up in the morning to get them. So they definitely wanted them, and they were enjoyable. So therefore, if it's something like that, then it would be more of a problem if it's chametz. So there are those that are stringent about this. Also, the general consensus is not to be, but if somebody wants to, there's definitely authorities that are stringent about this, but the general consensus is not in the realm of medicines unless it's something that tastes good. And the general way to kind of figure this out is that in general, we don't make a bracha on medicines. And the reason we don't make a bracha on medicines is because medicines aren't for enjoyment. The Gemara says that even if it's something that's edible, it's not there for enjoyment, we don't make a bracha. However, for these candy tasting medicines that taste good, which essentially make a bracha on, so they would also be considered edible in the realm of chametz, and therefore one would have to get rid of them. Meaning get rid of them, meaning or sell it to a non-Jew, unless it's obviously a life-threatening case, and in a life-threatening case, then anything is, all halacha says that the main thing is to protect the life. So that's basically the background of the medicine, and toothpaste is essentially also in the same category, that essentially it's not meant to be eaten. And even if he does eat it, we don't say there's achshave because he's not trying to eat it. And the Mishnah Berurah himself says that if a person eats it by mistake, and they're not trying to eat that, but by mistake they do eat it, so that you don't say achshave, you don't say he considered it food, because his goal is essentially not to consider it food and not to create it as food. So therefore, if he eats it by mistake and he swallows it by mistake, or it's in his mouth, and therefore it wouldn't be considered food. And there are those that debate also about these bubblegum tasting toothpaste, which the same debate that goes into the realm of the medicine, that they say that it might be enjoyable. Here it's less than the medicine because the medicine is essentially edible, and by the child, good tasting toothpaste is essentially not edible. So there's more reason to be lenient, but that's already a debatable topic. So as we leave the bathroom, we cover basically the idea of the shampoos and the soaps that most essentially hold, like we said, that it's not edible to a dog. We talked about which is very relevant today, the alcohol, that's rubbing alcohol, which essentially Moshe Feinstein says that many people will use this as a drink or can use it as a drink, probably to rephrase that, in a case they mixed it with something else. And we mentioned about the medicine, which the Chazon Ish says is also, even though he's eating it, and we talked about the fact, this is going back to the idea earlier, that we mentioned, why would anybody want to eat something that's not edible? So we said, hypothetically, it would come up by the medicine, but in reality, it's not coming up by the medicine. Where it would come up, the only time where this practicality of achshave, that you can't eat something that's not edible, would be in Russia, that he's drinking it down because he wants to become intoxicated. So there, even though what he's doing is abnormal, but the actual fact that he's drinking it, so he himself is kind of considering that as a food. So for that person, it would be prohibited to drink it on Pesach. But for everybody else, since he's not creating it as a food, as a standard food, just for him it's considered a food, so for everybody else it's not a problem. And we mentioned the Chazon Ish in medicine also, that since his goal is essentially not to eat it, rather just become better, so therefore it's not a problem. So Paul's asking, what about ethyl alcohol, pure or like in shan sanitizer? So we mentioned that if it's pure ethyl alcohol, that's what Moshe was talking about, or Moshe Feinstein. Or Moshe Feinstein writes in his tshuva that it would be a problem since it could be mixed with other things. But once it's in a hand sanitizer, so then essentially it's the same idea as a shampoo, that the rest of it kind of renders it not edible. And even though there are some that say there is, Rav Eider writes that it could be distilled, so then we do have to worry about it. That's definitely not the consensus of the majority of Paiskim, and even many Talmidim who I spoke to, the Talmidim students of Moshe Feinstein, that said their Moshe only held in pure vinegar, not if it could be taken out of something else, so therefore they say it's not a problem. Isopropyl alcohol, meaning one's edible and one's not. There's a difference, Paul, in being in ethyl and isopropyl, whether or not one's more edible. I think the standard was ethyl alcohol. I don't remember if he doesn't write exactly. He just writes, in his tshuva, he just writes the alcohol that's used basically to sanitize. If there's a difference between isopropyl and ethyl regarding that, I guess you'd have to know if any of them are poisonous or not. That would be the only difference, really. Yeah, so we'll have to look into this, Paul, and see if there is some kind of difference. Ramesha was probably talking about whatever the standard was that they had in his time. That's what I imagine he was talking about. So we already covered the bedrooms again, and we mentioned the idea that we're basically looking for a piece that's more than a kizayis, or less than that, in something that's clean, something that's dirty. A person's not going to come to eat it, and essentially they don't have to get rid of it. So now let's move on to the living room. So the living room is essentially the same as the bedrooms, that we have to get rid of anything that's larger than those 30 grams, the size of a kazayas. Anything smaller would be the same exact idea, whether or not it's edible or not. But there is another question of the bookshelf, because essentially, according to the letter of the law, any books in the bookshelf do not have to be cleaned off. However, if there's a specific book, somebody has a specific book living every day, and this is the book that they use by their Shabbos table. This is the book that they use when they read every week. So what happens? It goes on their Shabbos table, and as it goes on their Shabbos table, they're eating challah next to it, and the crumbs from the challah go into the book, and now they have a problem that there are crumbs inside the book, and when they bring it back to their table on Pesach, if they do, then they might come to eat the crumbs that are inside the book. So how do we get around, what do we do about that? Because there's an actual problem, they might come to eat it. So therefore, the poskim say that if you have a book in your shelf that you generally use for Shabbos, so those books, before bringing them to the table on Pesach, one should wipe down the cover and should wipe out the crumbs, that there shouldn't be any crumbs left in the book. So that's really the difference, just in relevance to books that are brought to the table, because once something's brought to the table, there's more of a problem that it's actually going to be eaten. So benchers pull definitely are the same, would be the same idea. The benchers definitely we have to, if we're using the benchers, then definitely they would have to be wiped off before Pesach, because those are something that's always used, and therefore something that's much more important to be able to actually clean off before we get to the Pesach. We're putting them on our tables, and we might come to put it in our mouth. Generally, most people have a separate set of benchers, if it's possible, for Shabbos and for Pesach. Now that we get to the kitchen, essentially everything becomes much more in the realm of not coming to eat it on Pesach. And the reason for that is because if we have crumbs there, if we get to the kitchen, we get to the refrigerator, we have crumbs that are inside our refrigerator. So these crumbs, essentially, if we leave them over there, and even if they're dirty crumbs, they're very likely on Pesach, when you put something inside our refrigerator, they're going to attach to what's inside our refrigerator. And once they attach to what's inside our refrigerator, the food on Pesach, we're going to come to eat them. And we're not allowed to eat the smallest amount of chametz on Pesach, even though we can own, technically, something that's less than 30 grams, but we can't eat it, even if it's the smallest particle. And therefore, in the refrigerator, we generally clean it out entirely so that there shouldn't be any crumbs that might attach the food you're putting in. You might, on Pesach, you might put down, a piece of cheese on the surface, and it might take up any crumbs. So therefore, we clean it out entirely. And if we can't get every crumb out, usually if we use a cleaning agent on the fridge, so then it makes the food particles that are left over inedible anyways. And we mentioned that chametz that's inedible is not going to pose a problem because it's not considered food. And even if invariantly we end up eating it, but we're not eating it because we actually want it. So therefore, there's not going to be an achshabi and won't be considered food. So once we use a cleaning agent on our food, on our refrigerator, even if there's something left over in between the cracks by mistake, it wouldn't be a problem. There's some people that are extra stringent to line it, which it's technically not necessary, but it's just a great idea to get into any problems that would otherwise be from food particles. It's just in lining the refrigerator, one has to be careful that they still leave the ability for the ventilation and to be able to go around and to be able to air should transfer, not to suffocate it, which could end up ruining the refrigerator. And then we get to another area, and these are basically the stove, countertops, pots. This brings in a whole new world. Because until now, we were talking about actual food particles that you could see. Once we get to counters, once we get to pots, once we get to the idea of ovens, it's not necessarily anymore about the food particles that you could see. It's not just a matter of wiping down everything on the surface. Because anything that comes into contact through heat does something very different. That if you have a surface and you have hot food that was put on top of that surface, then the food essentially gets absorbed into the surface. And once it gets absorbed into the surface, the flavor is there in the surface. And now technically, right now, it's definitely less than a kazai, so it's less than 30 grams. And as owning it, it's not going to pose a problem. But if we go ahead and we put another hot food on that surface, then the flavor that's inside the surface is going to come out and essentially enter the food. And now the food becomes prohibited on Pesach because we're not allowed to eat the smallest amount of chametz on Pesach. So therefore, our countertops, which are generally used to also put hot foods on, and even if we essentially put it on with a pot, but many times the pot overflows and it gets onto the counter, it's hot, it gets absorbed into the counter. So therefore, we generally need to do something that should make that we're not going to put another piece of hot food on the counter unless we get rid of the flavor and the taste that's inside the counter, unless we get rid of the absorption of chametz that went into the counter. So how do we do this? How do we make that flavor that's absorbed inside our counter, how do we get it now out of that counter? So essentially, the rule is when it comes to all cooking utensils and everything that's used for cooking, the way that it went in, that's how we could get it out. So essentially what we do is that since generally counters got chametz into them through overspilling, so what we need to do is that if we take a hot pot of water, this hot pot of water, after we heat it up on the stove, we could pour it onto the surface of the counter, and that hot water will essentially take out the blias, will take out the taste and the flavor that's inside the counter. Is that clear so far? Anybody?
Yes, Rabbi, it's clear.
Okay. However, there are two stipulations for this to actually work. Number one, it has to be a material that's able to push the flavor that's absorbed in through using a hot pot of water to take it out. For instance, metal, you could definitely do that too. You could pour the water on top of the metal, and then as it goes around the metal, the hot water, essentially the flavor will come out into the water. And once that happens, so now the countertop becomes kosher. Something that's real stone, marble, all these things can be kosher. However, when it's something that's formica or a plasticky material or something that's more of a earthenware kind of material, it's not based off of stone, it's not based off of metal. So that essentially will not, pouring hot water onto it will not take out the flavor, the taste, and the particles that are absorbed into it. So therefore, for that, really something else is normally done. We usually try to clean it with a cleaning product to make it inedible. And at the same time, we also try to, generally, once we do that, we also try to cover it with something that's waterproof. Because once we cover something that's waterproof, and even if we put down a hot piece of chametz on it, it will not transfer through something that's waterproof in order to get into the food we're putting on top of it. So that's generally the best way to go around it for a material that cannot be koshered. The best way to go around it is to put this covering on top of it, either another countertop or just a heavy-duty aluminum foil, so that shouldn't happen. I'm just going to plug in my computer a moment because I've noticed the battery's getting low. I didn't do it before. Just a second. All right, so this is essentially about countertops. So countertops, we mentioned that there are certain kind of countertops that can be koshered, and the way to do that is essentially through hot water. There's different systems also. If anybody wants to email, we can discuss the different systems besides just pouring hot water on it. There's different ways that it's possible to kosher it, but that's only on a kind of material that's a metal or it's a kind of a rock kind of material that can be kosher. Anything else, the best thing to do is to try to just put cleansing product on it, and then anything inside it becomes inedible. And as we spoke about, that any food that's inedible is not a problem of chametz. It just becomes like dirt in general. And the best thing to do afterwards is to cover it, and that takes care of all problems whatsoever. When it comes to the oven, so the oven grates essentially are technically not a problem of chametz, and the reason is because oven grates, we usually use the same oven grates for dairy and for meat. How could we do that? Because once the flavor from the dairy gets absorbed into the grate, when we put the hot meat pot down on top of it, why aren't we afraid that whatever is absorbed from the dairy into it is now going to go into the meat pot? So says Rav Moshe Feinstein that the moment that it hits the grate, it gets burnt up by the fire underneath it. So therefore, there's essentially nothing on top of the grates. However, the tradition is that we generally do is to be stringent and to try to kosher them anyways. However, there is a big difference that generally something that the flavor went in by a direct fire, we need to use a direct fire, as we mentioned, the same way that it goes in, that's the way to get it out. So we need to use a direct fire. Essentially, it would seem like we have to make a fireplace, heat it up, and put them inside. But since technically, according to the letter of the law, nothing needs to be done, so therefore it's enough to put them inside the oven on the highest temperature for about 15 minutes or so, and that will heat them up enough that it's a lighter degree of koshering, but it would be enough in this circumstance. That's generally what the poskim say, to take, if you want to use the same grates, it would be the best to put them into the oven on the highest temperature for 15-20 minutes. The inside of the oven today is pretty simple because most people have self-cleaning ovens. So generally, if you run it on a self-cleaning run, so then essentially it basically gets rid of anything that's inside the oven, and that's enough of the heat temperature to make it kosher now that it's able to be used for Pesach. And we should hope that after the self-cleaning, it might be better. I don't know exactly how it works. If there's going to be any particles left over, then I imagine they'd be burnt. And if it's burnt, essentially, it's not able to be eaten. And therefore, it wouldn't be a problem anyways. Some people just take the oven grapes on the self-clean cycle and they put them inside. But you have to know really your oven, the grates on top of the stove, the stovetop grates, you have to know what it might do to it. The other question is the microwave. And the microwave essentially can be, you could put a cup of water in for about 3 minutes and evaporate it. And since any flavor that went in the microwave went in through that heat and that evaporation source, so by putting it in on 3 minutes and running it, meaning after, microwave is not only self-clean, the self-cleaning is just going to burn everything out. Microwaves, we do have to wipe them down and clean them from any food particles, because once there's a food particle, then that is going to be transferred through the ear into any Pesach food that we put in. So we have to clean it out entirely, and the best is to do it also with something that renders it inedible. And once it's rendered inedible, so then it would be possible to technically, it shouldn't be a problem because any chametz that's not edible is not a problem. However, we are afraid that maybe the deep inside, the flavor inside did not get those cleaning ingredients. And therefore, the best thing to do is, which we should do, that's what the poskim do require, is to put that cup of water inside the microwave and run it for a couple of minutes. As it's evaporating, it's going to kosher everything. And therefore, once that happens, it's going to make the microwave be able to be used. So this is the basic idea, again, regarding the bedrooms, which we mentioned, the idea of having, essentially what we're looking for is more than a kazayas, more than 30 grams. We also should try to get rid of anything that's smaller than that, because if it's something that might be eaten because we don't want somebody to eat it on Pesach, unless it's dirty and you're not going to eat it anyways. We mentioned that basically the bathroom products are pretty much okay according to the letter of the law, except for, and according to the opinion of most authorities, except for the alcohol, which Moshe says that since it can be drinking is a problem. We mentioned the idea of books that are going to be brought to the table. So those books should definitely be cleaned, because if there's a crumb, books that came from the table be brought to it, if there's a crumb on it, and he's going to leave those crumbs on for after Pesach, on Pesach, he might invariantly come and put his finger on it and put it into his mouth as he's turning pages, and therefore those books should be clean. We mentioned the idea of the refrigerator. The best thing to do is to use a cleaning product that's going to make it inedible, and then some people line it. It's not necessary, but it's a great idea if somebody does. We mentioned the idea of the countertops. If it's a countertop that is able to become kosher, to be able to, for instance, it's stone or it's metal, we could do it through hot water. Otherwise, we should try to use a cleaning agent on it that makes it not edible. And otherwise, a person should, we mentioned, start using the cleaning agent and to cover it. And Paul is saying if countertops absorbs the flavor, is after one day not edible. So why is absorption a problem? But you can't do self-cleaning with grates and sides. That's a separate thing. So about the first thing is that even if it's inedible, that's not lecharchila. Lecharchila meaning if something became, first of all, Pesach is different, and even in a regular case in regular halacha, meaning not in regard to Pesach, even in a regular case, if something is a day old and thereby became inedible, that's only that if it by mistake happened that you put it on a countertop that was a day old, so it doesn't make it not kosher. But we can't do l'chadchila. We can't set ourselves up to get into the problem. And leaving our countertops like that is setting ourselves up. But you can't do self-cleaning with the grates inside. Why not? Why can't you do self-cleaning with the grates inside? Yeah, they will definitely they will get discolored. I think it might actually switch back. But the truth is it's not necessary. That would be Lieb and Gomer to do it inside there. You don't need to. You can really just leave it on 450 or something for like 15 minutes, and that would essentially be enough after they were clean. Which we said according to the letter of the law, even that doesn't need to be done. So we try to do that. If somebody doesn't want to do that at all, some people just line their grates with heavy-duty aluminum foil, which is also would take care of the problem because of being waterproof. Yeah. And then about the glass stovetops, so essentially it should be the same as grates, that anything that was on them got burnt up right away. And therefore we should be able to, in that circumstance, be able to kosher them, even though glass in itself is also debatable whether it absorbs anything. According to the Shulchan Aruch, glass doesn't absorb anything, and it never becomes non-kosher or never becomes chametz by having something hot touching it. I did have a long discussion about this with Shlomo Miller and the Rav and the Bochel, among a number of others. In a regular question that we had discussed with them, They had agreed that it doesn't essentially absorb and it gets burnt up right away. Yeah, that's the general what's written. I've seen that was written online, but they both agree that essentially glass, according to the letter of the law, doesn't absorb, and also glass would be the same idea that there's a fire underneath it. And we learned from a Rambam, there's a whole idea in itself. We learned from a Rambam that even the glowing is the same as a fire underneath it. So it should be the same thing. The reason why a glass stovetop could be a little more complicated is because many times you end up putting the pot in an area that's not directly on top of the globe. And we don't have that. In that case, it wouldn't be burnt up right away. So so maybe we'll discuss this poll privately, because essentially, according to what I discussed with the Rabbanim over here, there definitely is a way to do it. But being that it is a very controversial topic, so maybe we'll discuss that. Maybe we'll discuss that privately, and that shouldn't be too hard. But we'll discuss it over email or one-on-one, because I don't want to. This is a psak that I discussed with Shlomo and a few others, and I'd rather be able to work through all the separate steps and in itself. So we're not gonna fully cover the glass stovetops, even though seemingly the glass stovetops should be okay, as long as you're using just the center area. And if you're covering the glass stovetop and everybody agrees, there's not a question whatsoever, because then nothing is going to be able to get if you're covered with heavy duty aluminum foils, and nothing's going to be able to get underneath it. But if you're not covering the glass stovetop, so the part in itself, as you mentioned, the glass should not be a problem, because glass, according to the Mechaber, for sure for Svardim it's not a problem because it doesn't absorb. Also, everything should get burnt up right away. But you should definitely ask the question individually, because it is a controversial topic. So we'll definitely be glad to talk about it, Paul. But thank you for everybody for joining. If there's any specific questions, we have another 2 minutes, so we could cover that. There's a number of details also that we didn't manage to get to, but I think our time's pretty much up. So there's great resources on many different details that Berkowitz has online. I think they actually have it on h.com, which is a phenomenal resource to be able to go through the detailed parts of cleaning, as well as many kashrus organizations also do. And anybody is definitely welcome to email any questions, which I'll put up the email address. And if I don't have the answer that I definitely could find out, put up this email address just to. So anybody's welcome to send any questions individually or to discuss anything. And thank you everybody for joining. Until next week.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good night.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good night.
Good night.